Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto and I'm a photographer. Welcome to another video from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Today I'm taking a short photo walk with the Yongnuo 50mm F1.8 DFDSM lens. This is a review sample from Yongnuo, but they are not sponsoring this video in any way. And this is not even going to be a full review because this is not exactly a new product anymore. I think it's been out at least for about a year or so, and there are so many quality reviews already out there, and you can watch them here on YouTube if you wish. My very first thoughts with this lens were, who needs yet another 50mm f1.8 lens? There are so many, also must be at least a dozen or so, at least for Sony cameras. And by the way, this is available for the Sony E mount and the Nikon ZZ mount. And also for Nikon, I think there are more than a couple of 50mm f1.8 lenses available, and this is probably one of the most common lenses ever. But hey, before we go any further, let's take a look at some photos that I've shot on this lens, because in the end it's the photos that matter, nothing else. This lens is so-called Nifty 50, and like I said already, there are so many of these available. Some of them are very affordable, even cheap, and some of them are also quite mediocre optically. Some of them are great. This lens is not exactly cheap, but it's not super expensive either. This goes for about 250-300 euros or US dollars, depending on your geographical location or some other factors like ongoing special offers or something like that. For that price, you are allowed to expect some sort of decent optical performance. This lens category is highly competitive, and there are already some other lenses, similar lenses with a very good optical performance and fairly decent price too. A 50mm Nifty 50 is an incredibly versatile focal length, and it's good for pretty much everything you can imagine. It's good for portraits, landscapes, architecture, cityscapes. Maybe it's not good for tight interiors. If you want to capture the whole interior in one picture, then you'll probably need a wide angle. And talking about wide angles, a Nifty 50mm lens, it used to be like the most popular lens or angle of view, but today I think it's pushed aside a little bit by wide angles, because younger photographers, younger generation, they are used to wide angles because every smartphone has a wide angle lens as a standard camera, and pretty much everyone who's under 30 probably had their first photo moment with a smartphone camera. But now let's take a look at some more photos that I have shot on this lens. The maximum f1.8 aperture is of course great for some delicious shallow depth of field bokeh shots, but it's also very practical in low light. If you don't need a lot of depth of field, then you can stick to fairly low ISO values, and that's always a good thing. Here are some low light pictures that I shot the other night. In my people pictures, I deliberately stayed a little bit further away from my subject because I wanted to see how well the face tracking works in low light and from a distance, because it's always more of a challenge for the tracking to detect the faces and track them from a little bit further away. This lens is not super small, but it's not big either. I would describe it as a medium-sized full-frame 50mm lens. It has two programmable buttons, but I read in another review that these buttons may not work on older Sony camera bodies. But I can't confirm that because on my A7 Mark IV they work just fine. There's autofocus, manual focus switch, and the feature set is pretty decent for the price. And yes, the mount is also weather sealed, so there is some sort of weather sealing too for the price. And I think it's quite nice. But what about the optical performance? Is this lens sharp? The short answer is yes, it's very sharp, even wide open, even in the corners. Gets a little bit better, of course, when it's top down, and by about f5.6 there's nothing to complain, absolutely nothing. It's super sharp everywhere at f5.6. The backlight performance is also quite decent. These are the worst backlight pictures that I managed to get from this lens. But at the same time, I'd like to remind you that pretty much every fast aperture lens flares if you really try. I do not see any distracting major vignetting, but I do see a little bit of pincushion distortion, and it seems not to be auto-corrected. However, that can be firmware related, but as it happens, I had some problems with the firmware update. Let's first take a look at some more pictures and then I'll talk about the firmware update. Before I go into my failed firmware update attempt with this lens, I'd like to mention one kind of serious downside with this lens, and it's the focus breathing, which is very extreme. And it can be, probably is, a deal breaker for video shooters, but for photographers that can even be an upside, because the closer you focus, the narrower the angle of view gets. So you kind of get a little bit of extra bonus close-up performance with this lens. I compared the angle of view of this lens to my Sony 50mm F2.5 G series lens, and when I focused to infinity or close to infinity, the angle of view was pretty much identical, as you can see from these two sample pictures. However, at shorter focusing distances, as you can see in these two pictures, the focal length of this Yongnuo is clearly longer than the focal length of the Sony lens.
Outside I ran into a minor problem, so I had to come inside to finish this video. I have one more thing to add before I go into the firmware update issue. I mentioned minor pincushion distortion with this lens. However, now that I uploaded my pictures onto my computer, I realized that there is absolutely no distortion when I focus to infinity or something that is very far away. However, at close focusing distances there is a very distinct pincushion distortion. So the distortion increases at close focusing distances and it disappears at far away focusing distances. And now the firmware update issue. There is a USB-C port on the lens, and apparently you should first download a piece of application like an updater or something, and then you would connect the lens to your computer with a USB-C cable and then open the updater and go from there. However, I did not manage to download the updater. It's only 1.7 megabyte file, so very small file, but the data from Yongnuo server to my computer did not move at all. The counter, the timer in my browser went from 9 minutes to 11 minutes and then to 13 minutes and to 16 minutes, and at that point I decided to cancel the whole thing. And I think that's kind of a serious issue. I think you should be able to update the firmware pretty easily and reliably, no matter what kind of a product you have. However, this lens seems to function and perform pretty well with this current firmware. I was just curious to update the firmware just to see if there are some improvements and maybe better distortion corrections or something. it seems that the longitudinal chromatic aberrations, also called bokeh fringing, is really well corrected in this Yongnuo 50mm lens. And that is remarkable because many fast aperture lenses suffer from bokeh fringing. Here is a side-by-side comparison. On the left you can see the Yongnuo, and on the right you can see another lens that has really bad bokeh fringing. And it's easy to see how clean the Yongnuo picture looks in this comparison. At the start of this video I asked who needs yet another 50 f1.8 full-frame lens, because there are so many of these already. However, I think this Yongnuo earns its place in the market as another relatively affordable and quite solid option for Nikon Z and Sony E full-frame users, mainly because the optical performance is quite solid, the autofocus performance is great, and the build quality and feature set are quite good for the price. There are some downsides too, of course, and the seriousness of these downsides depend on what you shoot and how you shoot. The distortion characteristics are a bit weird, as I described earlier in this video. The focus breathing is quite extreme, and also the firmware update process, based on my experience, is not reliable. That's all I have for you in this video. If this was helpful or entertaining, please do consider buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below for that if you don't live in Finland. Thank you so much, and I'll definitely see you soon in the next video.